And all these things like blossomed in a multiple day period, right? Like people are inspired, they get it up like a couple days later. That to me is like the entire magic and promise of no code. Yep.
Welcome to The Future is No Code. My name is David Adkin. I am joined by none other than Vlad from Webflow. Thank you so much for being a part of this. If you don't know what Webflow is, for anybody out there that's just getting to this no-code content, no-code at Webflow is by far the best website building no-code platform there is. Everybody uses them. Adalo uses them to make their sites. It's more than just sites as well. Marketing sites, blogs, e-commerce, you name it, everything is beautiful. I love everything you guys do, from your actual product to your support team to all the content. They also had the No Code conference last year, the very first one. So they're definitely the leaders in the no code space. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, David. I'm very excited to be part of this.
Awesome. And again, for you who are joining us, don't know, the quick format is we kind of have a little intro section where we figure out how we define the no-code space. Then we'll jump into how this will affect all different types of people, roles, companies, organizations in the future. There's a little predicting section. I'll try to keep my best to get Vlad to give us some good predictions. It's a little tough to get the exact, timelines of when those things will happen, but interesting to see how everybody's responses, how all the different experts' responses compare and contrast is, one of the big overall goals from this. So let's get things started here. All right. So when did you get into no code, and, what made you start Webflow?
So when I got into no code, it definitely wasn't a thing yet. This is back in probably officially in 2004, 2005, something like that, when I was working in an agency and had the original idea for Webflow that was all about removing the need for a coder in the middle of a designer and a client. And, you could argue that that is no code because you're removing code from the equation, solving the same problem. To me, it didn't seem like it was a new idea really, because Visual Studio existed. Dreamweaver was very popular back then, and it was already kind of an established path that WYSIWYG, or sort of that acronym of what you see is what you get, was what no code meant. Maybe there's like some code output and you can have access to it, but that's kind of where my mind goes when I think of getting into no code. And the original inception behind Webflow is exactly that. Like, there was a design, I was working at this agency that had like very large customers like Apple, HP, Tennis Channel, Quicksilver, etc. And we had a very, very talented design department with an art director and all these designers. And then I was an intern on the CMS team that sort of took their ideas and had to translate them to the CMS, writing HTML, CSS, SQL queries, and that kind of thing. And one day I saw the invoice for one of those clients, and it was so astronomical that I thought, okay, there's an opportunity here. Like, I'm here doing this minimum wage job that is essentially a barrier between what designers want to get out there to what actually ends up going live on the website. And it just, it felt unselfish in the point that I was working myself out of a job potentially, but it felt like there was some sort of opportunity there that you could make a CMS that sort of has that out of the box where designers can declare stuff immediately. They don't have to go through the translation layer. So that was the genesis. And then sort of like it ebbed and flowed from there and didn't end up leading to this version of Webflow until 2012. But that was the original inspiration.
Awesome. Yeah. And it's great to hear, everyone's perspective of like, for me, it was like from the, design perspective of, I couldn't make that a reality. So, that's how I entered it. So it's always interesting where you're kind of coming into that equation. Awesome. So also you alluded to this a little bit in your first answer, but what is your definition of no code. And sometimes it's easier to explain by saying, what do you think is considered in the bucket of no code, and what are some of the things that maybe you consider are not in the bucket of no code?
Yeah. To me, I haven't defined this very crisply before, but I think how I would, like my gut sense is that no code is the bucket of any tool or action that leads to the creation of working software that doesn't require a translation layer of translating a design to code or to the working product. So, the creation of a form that takes inputs that traditionally, 20 years ago was done by a programmer, now could be done maybe via Wufoo or whatever. You could categorize that as no code because you're solving something through a visual interface or some sort of non-code workflow that in the past was solved via a coding workflow. But it's generally in this bucket of like creating software, creating workflows, or creating things that solve a problem that a computer now solves that classically was done by a developer or by a programmer.
Cool. Yeah, that's it's definitely interesting there where you're saying, I think the keys thing you're saying is like, it used to be done traditionally maybe by developers, and that the output is something that would be some type of software where I'm also trying to think, you're saying traditionally used to be done like by that, but so I guess, are you including, I guess e-commerce solutions then kind of go into that bucket as that used to be
that is right.
Apps, and then and I guess automation then goes into that. I'm also trying to think if there are any other types of things in the past, I guess. So like, then do you go all the way back to, is like Blogger considered like a no code platform? Because that,
I think
took
the creation, maybe not the authoring itself. So for example, you could say, Microsoft Word is no code. I wouldn't say that, because like Word, the things that you create in Word don't have execution, right? It's basically an artifact of something you create, but it doesn't have like a rules engine, right? Whereas Excel is a lot closer to no code and could be categorized as no code depending on how you sort of bucket things, because you could create a system in Excel where you put in some inputs and it does computation for you that classically would either have to be done by hand, or you have to write a program with classical computer programming or whatever.
Yeah. And that's definitely in line with even some of the first people that get into no code were really kind of doing a lot of things on spreadsheets. I talked with Tara Reid from Apps Without Code. That was really how she first got in there. Was it was some art app that she inputted into the spreadsheet from those forms and would do that. So yeah, I think that's definitely a lot more of a crisp definition there. The wording maybe we can all work out, but I like your definition seems pretty airtight there. All right, let's see.
I think one quick thing I think about in my mind always is like no translator, like no person that has to do the translation for you, right? So it's almost like, I don't know if you've ever used Google Translate, where it has that mode where you can point at a sign and it shows you in whatever language you choose what that actually says. That's kind of what no code feels like to me, because typically you would have to learn the language yourself, or you would have to have a buddy to sort of do that translation for you. Now you're kind of in a no translation world where there's no friction between you might not get the exact same fidelity than if you were fully fluent in the language, and it doesn't make you fully fluent in the language, which is why I think we'll get to a little bit later that not everything is possible with no code, right? You do so much more with programming and even low code, that it's kind of like that analogy where it's good enough to solve like these huge problems, but it might not be like the ultimate flexibility that you would have with actually knowing the language or actually knowing a programming language, etc.
Cool. 100% agree. Let's see. So, and then again, we alluded to this earlier, but like the space hasn't always been called no code. So do you have an approximate time of like when you think that started, or actually like a person or like something that was like, hey, now it is no code?
I honestly was racking my brain to try to
Yeah.
figure out. It definitely wasn't a thing in 2012.
Right.
Nobody was talking about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There is, you know, a no code development platform term that was coined at some point. And I know low code became a much more prevalent term, maybe 5+ years ago. So I think there was in some iteration of people talking about code and low code and sort of enterprise use cases of low code, no code originated. And I think it was a slow ramp up that maybe nobody really championed. I don't think,
Yeah.
I haven't seen,
No,
the
no.
person standing behind no code is
I
like, this is
know.
the best term for it, et cetera. In fact, I've seen the opposite where people are like,
Yeah.
this is not the best term
Yeah.
for this movement, et cetera. So I don't know where it originated. Definitely was, it really, really heated up 3 years ago, approximately, and way more so 2 years ago, and more recently, like over the last year.
Cool. Okay, and then one last thing in this intro section. Do you like no space code or no dash code?
I think it's got to be no dash code. Like
Okay, all right.
it has to be its own term, not just two words strung together,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it helps with the idea that we're not actually saying there's no code involved. There's tons of code in no code,
Right.
right? Because you're creating a visual interface potentially, or some sort of new workflow that abstracts away code, but you still need to build that thing, and there's the coders involved in creating those abstractions. So I think the no dash code alternative makes that more clear, that it's more of a pronoun than
Okay.
it is
Yeah.
a negative of something that's involved in the process.
Yeah. Yeah. That's definitely one of the questions I'm like most fascinated about hearing everybody's answers to. So,
Mhm.
so we can get a little bit get on the same page with that, just
Yeah,
as,
I do. I do love the idea that it's a little controversial,
yeah.
right? Because if it
It's
was something like visual development, or WYSIWYG programming, or whatever, you've heard like citizen development,
yeah,
citizen
yeah.
programming, or whatever. It's not as like, what does this mean? Like it kind of adds enough controversy that people have a discussion about it,
Yeah.
and I think that's been helpful. But I think overall it's just kind of a confusing
Yeah. Yeah.
in branding.
All right, cool. All right. So the next big section here, how this is really gonna affect everybody. This is probably the most important thing, what most people are excited about in this space as well. It's broken down into 4 different general groupings, so we can try to keep it,
Mhm.
contained. Obviously,
Yep.
this has huge effects on everybody. So the first group are, or really is, businesses. So how do you think this will impact, our entrepreneurs who are starting up, their startups, they're
Mhm.
getting something started? What do you think this is going to mean for small businesses? And then what do you think this is going to mean for the, medium to large enterprises?
Yep. So I think it's going to be weighed much more heavily towards the smaller businesses initially, and by that I mean, like, very small startups, small businesses, entrepreneurs, etc. New ideas that are emerging, where no code removes the barrier, the classical barrier of, okay, I have to build a dev team, I have to go validate this, spend many months, if not years, of validating a problem before launching it, then hoping that users arrive and convert and upgrade, start using it, etc. And now with no code, that barrier to entry is a lot lower. Not only do you not need a dev team in many situations, and in very kind of in the case of Webflow, something as basic as creating a website, right, is needs the attention of, okay, I have a very unique brand, or this new service is sometimes lives and dies based on how it's presented. So the fact that you don't even need a dev team now, even with kind of an Upwork, get a designer, like build it on the cheap through a developer, even when cost is low, the speed of all that and the number of people involved is significantly cut down by having tools like Webflow and other no-code tools, where you can go validate an idea and present it in a way that it's unclear to anybody that you're not actually using code. Like, it just looks like anything else that any startup would present, whether they're using code or not. I think that aspect of you can deliver ideas to market much faster is huge. And for enterprises, it's going to take longer to catch up to that mentality, because they have much larger requirements for what an initial version of something needs to do, right? So just to extend an existing product that might already be like localized or have deep integrations to other parts of the business, enterprises have to kind of carve out smaller use cases. Maybe it's like tiny landing pages or marketing experiments where they can start to integrate that as part of the process. It's going to be a slower burn to get to being able to meet those needs. That's where low code plays a much bigger picture right now, where the vast majority, like 50% solve through UI, and then 50% you solve through, and that ratio might be different for different companies or for different workloads, but it's still, you're solving a lot of unique problems through code. So for enterprises, I think it's going to take quite a bit of time to start seeing this as like a key tool in their tool set. But overall, it's going to be an obvious solution to more and more workflows, especially as the tools mature. Because just like spreadsheets, right? There's so many things that used to be built by code that are just now solved with spreadsheets, and you can see they're solved increasingly more with Airtable and other sort of workflow automation tools that look like a spreadsheet but start to be like spreadsheet plus, like Coda, Notion, so many other no-code tools that can be applied as a computational solution rather than like a note-taking or information presentational solution. So I think this is just like any technological innovation that takes away some parts that are hard and makes underlying exposes the underlying power of computing. It just means that businesses can do more with less, right? Just like SaaS services, just like the internet itself, just like Zoom, just all the things that have happened over the last 25 years after the internet has been invented. And before that, all these are good tailwinds for businesses to really focus on the problem that they're trying to solve, not get bogged down in the weeds of, okay, how do we actually do the nitty gritty of coding up the website or doing a new marketing experiment and waiting for engineers from our product to code it up because they're waiting for a sprint or some cycles or whatever. So all of this is just like spreadsheets in decades past, just opens up businesses to iterate much faster. But the thing that's most exciting to me is not what it helps existing businesses do, but the fact that it unlocks the ability for a lot of people to create businesses that otherwise they already had the idea for, but couldn't get the developers or couldn't afford the developers. So that's the most exciting part, is that it actually leads to new business creation. And I think that's the one that we're only now seeing some signs of adoption, but I think that's going to be much, much bigger in the future. Like, I fundamentally believe that 10% of all the SaaS services that have are yet to be created have been created so far. So there's just going to be so many. Maybe they might be much smaller. They're not going to be like the Facebooks of the world or the Oracles of the world. But I think there's so many niche things that are just waiting for this capability to be available so that people can get them to market. It might be like tiny $1 million businesses, but and not like on the stock market. But I think so many are kind of locked away right now because it's so hard to build.
Yeah, it's fascinating to watch how it's going to transform from, today, like most enterprise SaaS, they have massive backlog. I worked at a previous company that, we have massive backlogs of features that you're trying to get to because you're trying to make it available for such a huge, wide range of, of customers. And now what you're saying with this like more niche focus is you potentially, would be able to build for those smaller things. So it's a more tailored solution for that specific problem. And then also, I think what you were alluding to, where it's actually different people are now able to do it. So they have different problems than maybe the traditional people who were in design and tech and development that maybe aren't even having any of those problems or don't happen enough times to maybe validate, an expensive, investment in those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think the different people part is critical because 0.3% of the world knows how to code, or I think, that number is obviously higher to how many people can like hire a coder.
Right.
But I'm convinced that a lot more people have ideas for, products and services, et cetera. So the fact that this no longer requires you to be one of those 0.3%, or it doesn't require us to expand that 0.3% to like 1%, which is hard. We've been trying to do that for 30 years now.
Yeah.
And it still remains pretty low. It just means that more people are able to practice that. Like, hey, I have this idea, I'm going to try to make it real. For the same reason that access to YouTube, for example, gave a lot more people access to video production. They're not movie studios. They don't. They already had sort of entertaining ideas in their head. Maybe they didn't even have those ideas before they discovered the medium. But now we have hundreds of millions of people creating really awesome original content. It might not be, you know, hitting a box office or whatever, but even in the world today, it's keeping the world entertained and keeping the world informed.
Yeah.
Because those people now have been unlocked to use that medium. And it
definitely fits into that that niche where it's like, you know, there are very niche content on YouTube as well that, you know, is amazingly entertaining for those specific communities that, you know, now exist. And some of those then pile up to be, you know, even larger, where then they do become box office type of things as well. Awesome. Okay, let's see. So the second group here is a little more focused on the actual, like, you know, traditional tech side of things right now. So, you know, obviously, like, you talked about this a lot earlier with the translating layer, and that's definitely something that I saw, you know, previously at the company that I was working on, you know, being a true UX designer that doesn't know how to code, having to then hand it off to the developers and do all the planning, and there's PMs involved. So what do we think, you know, and again, it's a little bit easier for, like you were saying, newer businesses, smaller businesses to get started with maybe the no code, but what do we think this is going to do for the developer designer handoff, for PMs, maybe the traditional, you know, tech companies that have lots of those roles in their teams today?
Right. I think it's a gradient depending on the team. And what we're seeing most at Webflow is that for developers, it means that even though conceptually a lot of people experience no code initially, is like, okay, we're trying to work developers out of a job, right? But really what's happening is we're trying to automate the things that are most prone for automation, and not just automation, but like direct access to the people who need that automation, which is namely the designers. Like the no code makes designers the heroes of, okay, not only did I imagine a UI flow or a product or whatever, but I also built the working thing or close to the working thing before I hand that off to developers to like integrate into a like larger application, or sometimes ship directly to production, right? If it doesn't require any of that stuff. So for designers, this is like, you know, not a secret weapon anymore, but it's just a superpower, right? Because they're doing the work of two people now, and they're feeling more creative doing it, because you do have to onboard a little bit to understand the medium. You have to understand how, in Webflow's case, how the box model works, how classes work, how kind of like how to think about a flexible canvas, because you don't know, it's not like Figma where you just don't know what your available constraints are. But once you sort of learn those things, you get these superpowers of like delivering to production. For developers, we've initially seen kind of this hesitance of like, this is never going to work, the code generator is going to suck, or whatever, like 7 years ago. But now what we see is just elated developers of saying like, I'm no longer involved in marketing. I get to go work on the hard stuff, on the really interesting problems. And we have so many of those that are underserved that we're going to need more developers than ever. Like we're going to have a shortage of developers for decades until, you know, general AI takes over and kills us all.
We'll have another interview for that later on.
yeah, exactly. So for maybe it's kind of bad for some developers who aren't able to quickly retool. Like let's say there are developers so all they know is to take a Photoshop file and translate it to HTML and CSS. Like those developers are going to have to like level up and say, okay, how do I now build, you know, front end sites on Gatsby, or some sort of like static site generator, or go deeper on the stack and like learn algorithms and become a backend engineer. All those, but I think that's a small change that most developers are going to be able to accommodate. For the same reason why developers used to be involved in magazine production, right? To translate the PostScript, that's no longer a thing, right? But all those developers found jobs elsewhere because the general skill of writing code and thinking how you send instructions to a computer and using sort of like these coding frameworks and principles it's so applicable that you just kind of relearn. It's like learning how to use a bigger hammer when you already know how to use a hammer. For PMs, it's even it's as good as for, well, maybe not just as good as it is for designers, but PMs get to move faster as well. They can validate ideas sooner. They can vapor test things faster. They can they can rely on their designers in the research phase a lot more so than waiting for like the classic waterfall of like, okay, we'll design something, we have to wait for dev to go implement it, or we have to prototype it in code and then somehow present it to users. NoCode just lets you test like an 80% solution much faster, like sometimes 10 times faster than traditional code would. So I think it's great for understanding, because a core responsibility of PMs is to really understand the problem that they're solving and to validate what success looks like, kind of potentially early direction, and no-code tools are only getting better and stronger at helping them do that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I definitely am excited to see it also, kind of be an entry point into, development. It's a lot more accessible now for maybe a designer or somebody that is more tech, like maybe less techie, and they're like, wait a second, I can do things, but like I'm stopped by this no code layer at the moment, but now I understand the basics. It's like very much, my personal experience, like using Webflow, but now I understand, like you're talking about the box model, like I didn't know what that stuff was or what those limitations were, like, how things flex and stuff like that ahead of time. But it's a much easier, I would feel much more comfortable now kind of making that entry point. So definitely to your point there, is an easier way to kind of get into it. All right. So switching to the third group. So this would be consulting in general. So what is this maybe going to mean for current development, mobile and web development shops? And what is this going to mean for maybe freelancers today? And also then finally, like, what is this also gonna mean for or people that don't think of themselves as dev shops or dev consultants, maybe your traditional consulting business consultants? What is it gonna mean for all three of those parties?
I think it depends on the dev shop and the freelancers or agencies, but what we've seen is that across the board, it just lets people do a lot more with a lot less and much faster. So even if your main value add to a customer is we're a dev agency, at the end of the day, that's not what you're selling. You're not selling code. You're not saying, okay, we are going to a client and saying, here is the JavaScript we're going to deliver, right? That's never the case. What you're selling is we're going to give you whether it's a website or a product or a service or a mobile app or whatever, that's what you're selling. So no code helps you get to that much faster. So what we see among freelancers and agencies, especially, is that they're able to sell the same value, which means that they're usually charging the same exact price as the same agency if they have a dev in-house or not, because they're providing the same value to the customer, right? Like you're still getting the same websites. Customers no longer care how it was created, as long as it's performant, it looks beautiful, it's functional, like SEO is top notch, like for the same reason that you or I probably don't care how a PDF was generated, as long as like it looks like people really used to care about how the postscript was generated in a PDF, right? So maybe there are some dev shops who are solely based on this translation layer of we don't do the design work, we don't work directly with the client. All we do is take a design and we translate to let's say Photoshop or whatever. Not Photoshop, sorry, WordPress or some sort of code framework. Those dev shops are going to be outclassed by freelancers and agencies that are selling the full service, right? They're selling the actual value to their customers, and they're implementing directly through no-code tools, and many times augmenting it with code, which kind of puts you into that low-code territory. But more and more so, things that used to be low-code, even with Webflow 5 years ago, are now we have no-code ways of doing, as the product and functionality catches up. And in terms of non-dev consultants, you have these like service integrators and like even sort of the McKinsey and the huge sort of consultants.
The main consulting groups,
Exactly. They can move much faster, just the same way they yield Excel as a powerful tool. They can yield Russian brain, sorry. They can wield these no-code tools as a much faster way to iterate and provide solutions that actually fit into the use case that no-code can provide for. So it like really speeds up their ability to present something to the client and deliver value in a way that doesn't degrade the value that they're actually providing. I can imagine that there was a time where I think the transition happened probably over the last 3 or 4 years, where clients would get sort of like this spidey sense feeling of, hey, I ordered this website, right? We talked about it. We talked through the brand strategy, the voice, the content, or whatever. And literally 3 days later, you delivered the site, right? Because Webflow makes that possible.
Yeah.
And there's like this like spidey sense of like, you know, what am I paying you 50K for or whatever?
Yeah.
Because there's like this, you know, assignment with lower quality clients of like dollars per hour or whatever, where it's not focused on the value. Whereas it's actually more valuable for you to get that same thing in much more like a shorter amount of time. I think there's some quote, I forget exactly what it is, but when, you know, you pay an expert to answer a question and you pay them like $10,000 or whatever, and they're like, oh, it only took you a minute to answer that. Like, you're not paying for the minute it took me to answer. You're paying for like the 10 years it took me to get that knowledge.
The 10,000 hour, you know, 10,000 hours that I had to get that answered for you for a minute.
Right. And the value that that answer provides to you and your business, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I think it really benefits all consultants who are on the bleeding edge and are focused on providing value, because it's as simple as providing the same power with a lower investment, whether it's time or money, but overall that has value, because you're bringing that value, sooner, and the savvy ones are going to be able to take advantage of that. The fact that their like cost structure is lower, the time to deliver the same value is lower, and sell that to customers as even like an extra, let alone sort of like this downgrade of like, oh, it's not real code, and it might not be scalable, et cetera.
Awesome. All right. The last group here is so going a little bit larger here, but you know, society in general. So just some few buckets that maybe don't fall into some of those other roles. You know, what do you think this is going to mean for our personal lives, in terms of how we view, you know, things that used to be had to be made with software that you're saying now, like that translation can happen in my own personal life. What do you think this is going to mean for our kids, maybe traditionally focusing on their education involved with this, as well as what do you think this is going to mean for economic disparity? I know we touched on that a little bit earlier, but you know, just kind of coming full circle on this.
Yep. Well, I think it's going to take a while. It's going to start with businesses and like more sort of revenue generating things where this is immediately more applicable. One analogy that comes to mind is Zoom, right? Zoom very much focused on the enterprise, on like large scale meetings, et cetera. Now Zoom is, you know, my kids are upstairs using it for school, right? And we're just using it to hang out with friends. And it's there's a lag to when that sort of business value is realized in like more social context, et cetera. So I think no code is going to, it's not really kind of consumerized yet, right? It is consumerized in some cases. Like if you look at the Shortcuts app on iOS, that's no code, right? You're automating things like when this happens, do this, and here's like some logic or whatever. That's already hitting us, right? But we've had things like that for the last 20 years, right? Depending on where you look. So whether you categorize that as no code or not is however you want to stretch the definition. But even this exact concept of the way we talk about it today, you know, the thing that enables you to do without code what you were typically able to do with code in the business context is going to mean for the vast majority of us, it means that more of our needs are met through entrepreneurs that are using no code to create new products and services and bring more things to market that will have more competition and more kind of availability to solve kind of longer tail problems that affect our daily lives. I think for kids, it's going to become more and more of a established, like creating software is going to be more and more of like a basic skill, almost like literacy, right? I think before we talked a lot about learning to code being that literacy, but I think it's sort of missing the forest for the trees, right? When we teach kids to use a computer, right, like use a word processor, we don't teach them how characters are represented in like ASCII or like machine code or whatever.
Yeah.
The most important thing is that they can communicate as like digital citizens, etc. Similarly, like no code or creating stuff with no code, the most important thing is that people, not just kids, can take advantage of the power of like the mediums we have created as a society, the internet being like the most widely distributed and the one that touches the most parts of our lives. How do we get more people to see that as a tangible medium for which they can create and where they're not just consumers, right? So already I know plenty of kids who are using tools like Webflow, tools like Adalo to create like little toy apps, right?
Yeah.
that may automate some small like little reminder in their lives. Or my daughter runs this animal fact site where she collects like facts from her friends, and they're all like filled with puns and stuff, and she just runs it and adds new facts as she sort of like discovers some, chuckles it, enters it
Yeah.
into the CMS, and sends it like a text to her friends saying like, hey, check out this latest one. Like no economic value, right?
Yeah.
But already understanding the principles that, hey, I can have the internet is my playground, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is more than just something I consume, and more than just like, it's not like Netflix where I just watch. It's more like Roblox where I create and I participate. And I think that's the biggest shift that no code opens up, that it just takes this super powerful medium of software and distribution that the internet gives us and just puts it into a lot more hands. And in terms of economic disparity, I think it's just like extrapolating that trend, right? When you take something that is really, really hard to do and it's only possible, by 0.3% of the world, and that's because it takes a long time to get a computer science degree. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of money to get, go to these boot camps. It takes a lot of, you have to have a lot of both resources and luck and privilege and kind of past past experiences to even participate in something like that and have the chance to learn something as complex as code. And that keeps a lot of people out, right? Even people who are trying to learn how to code and participate, as software engineers, there's all these systemic forces that are either keeping them out or kicking them out after certain amounts of time, like they don't have a great experience. And I think no code is sort of like that leveling, hopefully equalizer that just says, hey, no matter who you are, the barrier to entry is so much lower now. And you don't have to learn 20 years of front-end development or back-end development to be on the same playing field. You just have to have a great business idea. You have to have drive to be able to take that to fruition. Yes, you're going to have to learn kind of the tool set, but it's not going to take you years or even quarters. It might take you weeks, and then you're off to the races. So I think that will be great for how many people participate, like the demographics of the people who participate. It's just like a new opportunity to start over, almost the same way the Renaissance was for who can create art. Or I know it's still like pretty exclusive,
Yeah.
who was like promoted or whatever, but the fact that over the last 400 years we've gotten to the point where anybody really who wants to try to write a book can, and there's still challenges with distributing it and promoting it, but it's so much more accessible than it was 400 years ago, right? So I think that that just levels the playing field, at least pretty significantly. Maybe not in a world-shaking way, but I think that will solidify more and more as these tools become more powerful and as they become more accessible.
Yes, I 100% agree. With all those things is, I'm definitely, kind of most excited for what you're talking about. I know it's like the long tail on a lot of that, of those last three questions, but, really seeing that play out is definitely something that I think drives a lot of the people in no code today is like, that tail end, of it. Okay. So the next section here is maybe the most difficult. You can feel free to give justifications for these or just give approximate dates. If you could give some approximate estimations, that would be great for, kind of contrasting with everyone else's answers. All right. So predicting some things in the future. So when do you think it will be as common to make an app as it is to make a PowerPoint presentation today?
I think that will take quite a bit of time, at least 5 years.
Okay. All right. 5 years.
It,
Yep. Yep. Oh, you can feel free to explain.
by the way,
yeah.
my estimation skills are not the best,
It's
especially when I
all
was
good.
a software engineer starting even before Webflow.
Oh, yeah.
Everything for me was 2 months. It's like, oh, you want to build an AI that can drive? 2 months. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously that's possible in 2 months. You want to build a new form? 2 months.
Yeah.
So
All right. Good caveat. All right. When will colleges start? And again, it's like,
yeah.
most college, or, just like,
Mhm.
enough colleges where it's like a real thing. When do you think they'll
Right.
start offering things that use no code in their
Mhm.
classes?
Mhm.
And then maybe when will that trickle down to,
Yep.
grade school level?
Yeah. We already know, like internally at Webflow, we know that there's hundreds of colleges already offering classes in, they might not categorize them as no code. They might categorize them as web design, for example, with Webflow, or visual development, or software creation, or product validation, or something like that, where they routinely teach these tools as something that will help you launch faster, or validate an idea, or be a web designer, etc. So that's by far not most colleges, though. It's
Yeah.
primarily in schools that have new media programs, or have some sort of entrepreneurial programs. I think most colleges, probably, I would say 3 years from now.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is we have been at a time when most colleges offered Dreamweaver as or something that was centered around Dreamweaver as a key part of many curricula. So but the reason I think that happened was because it was very clear that once you learn that one tool, you actually have like career longevity based on that tool, right? And the principles that you learn in that journey of learning through that tool. And we don't have any sort of consolidation in no code right now. We're still very divergent right now, where there's so many different options and so many ways that I think colleges fear that being locked in around a certain thing, or teaching something that might not be portable in the long term. Where you still see people concentrating on code, right? Like they'll teach something like WordPress because they know it's going to be around for 40 years or whatever, but they're still a little hesitant to teach like more tools like Webflow, even though we know there are hundreds, if not thousands, that we might not know about already doing that. But it will be kind of like a slower burn than what we might want. And in grade school, I think that the answer is kind of the same. We already see a lot of code-like teaching starting to happen in schools, where schools are teaching Scratch and other ways to, like in a more abstract way, get kids to program that might not be like right in a text editor. So the concepts are already being taught, but no code tools specifically, 5 years maybe. I know a lot of teachers are already doing that, and especially like maker classes, but just the friction of first of all, you can't even sign up for Webflow as a 13-year-old, right?
Yeah.
Let alone a 7-year-old, because terms of use and like US laws and those kinds of things. So there's probably a lot we have to figure out before that becomes like a very mainstream thing.
Cool. All right. Next up. So when do you think there'll be more products that are launched on a site like Product Hunt, let's say, just so we have some barrier or some, a lot of products get launched all over the place. So something that would launch on Product Hunt that are built, with no code as opposed to traditional coding.
I think I will be more optimistic than 5 years. I'd say that's on the order of 18 to 36 months.
Fantastic.
Because already we're seeing a lot of momentum of things launching on Product Hunt. And again, because it opens up the ability to create software from like 0.3% to like maybe 30%, it's just a volume game at that point. It just takes so much less time. It might not be as, as deep or as like developed as like a Product Hunt post from, I don't know, like Facebook or something like that, or from a startup that's funded and been working on something for 2 years. But it's like good enough that it solves a specific problem really well and looks like really polished and is indistinguishable from to most people that it's, built with code or no code.
Yeah, I know. It's like a little fascinating because like, how do you even categorize that? Because like it's going to look indistinguishable. So some of it's like,
Yeah.
not really even sure how to even like
And
calculate that. But yeah,
right. And I think it's going to go fast in terms of the inflection point, because when, let's say you mentioned, Blogger, right? 20
right.
years ago or whatever, the initial inclination was, oh, okay, only like non-sophisticated people are going to use this sort of drag and drop, just click, add a blog or whatever. The real bloggers are running their setups with HTML and CSS, and they have like ultimate flexibility or whatever. And then once people realize that it's so much easier, maybe you lose a little on the flexibility side, but you make it so much faster for people to publish their thoughts or whatever. The amount of new people you get into that new practice, maybe all the old folks are still, hacking on their deployments and like really
Yeah.
keeping things super technical, but you're adding a million more people who are now blogging, right? So it's just a volume game.
Numbers game. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's see. All right, so another one. So this is a little bit weird because like these things move a little bit, but
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when do you think maybe no code will meet up with low code in terms of functionality, or are those just always going to stay like for like the same distance apart, or
Yeah.
where kind of are you on that?
I think they will never converge.
Okay.
So just like no code will never converge with code.
Okay.
For the same reason that a word processor will never converge with, being able to draw something on a piece of paper. There's just like a lot more detail you could provide when or if you're taking Photoshop and like trying to manipulate pixels individually. So they will never get to the same sort of convergence point. However, the delta between what you can do in no code and low code and code by extrapolation is getting smaller. So things that required like low code before 3 years ago, now we have some no code approaches for, right? So I think low code will be less and less kind of this must. You're going to have to break out of low code as the requirement, for example, for a lot of enterprise use cases, especially as no code catches up. So I think the gap will narrow, but there will be things that you will have to solve with code that no code won't provide. And I think that a lot of like, for example, at Webflow, we're developing a plugin architecture right now where everything is no code as much as we want to make it, but there's still a lot of times where you kind of like do a custom embed or a dynamic embed, or a developer has to step in and say, oh, here's like a common workflow, let's say export to Airtable or pull something in from Airtable that right now I would have to do with code, so it will classify it as low code, but then that developer will create a plugin, do that once for the millions of people that need that, but it would be presented in a way that's no code, right? Because you can just like bind to it in our CMS or just link it to your Airtable kind of API key or whatever. And then that previously low code approach has now become no code and the same problem is solved. So more and more of that is going to start happening to where the divergence is going to close, but there's always going to be areas that you're still solving.
Yeah. All right. I like it. All right. Next up. So when do you think we will see a level? When do you think we'll see a product at the level of like popularity and users, let's say of like a Trello or a TurboTax or HelloSign that's built, on a no code platform?
Ooh, that's because of that hesitation of there's always going to be things that you're going to want to solve with code, and it just doesn't make business sense for a company to try to abstract some things that are like super niche to try to build a no code solution on top of it. I think that every single product in the next 5 or 10 years that gets to this level of popularity is going to have some code.
Okay.
Right. So it will have to be like low code by some virtue, but we already have like Shopify has some like billion-dollar companies that are technically no code, right? That previously would have required like Magento or something else or like a team to spin that up. I want to say there's like because of the volume game, I want to say there's going to be something that is on that order, because I've already seen like games created in no code. I've seen so many things that one of them is going to be simple enough and powerful enough and scalable enough that it's just a matter of time that something like that emerges. Maybe it's not going to be like a multi-billion-dollar company,
Right.
but in terms of popularity, 1 or 2 years.
Okay. All right. Awesome. And then, so I mean, I think you kind of answered the second part of that, which is, do you think one of them will IPO on a no-code product, or do you think there will be a point, or I mean, I guess you can also guess like a long time in the future, but
companies are at IPO being based on spreadsheets before,
right.
like
Okay.
where
Right.
their tech stack is a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
but you're sort of stretching
The
the
definition of no-code there.
definition there. It's hard to predict when the first no-code product will IPO. I definitely believe it's possible.
Yeah. Okay.
I know Bubble has claimed that they had some company that is like doing billions in revenue that's
Yeah.
built purely on no code. I'd love for that to be true. So if you're already doing billions of dollars in revenue, that's definitely IPO
Yeah.
IPO
Yeah.
candidates. So
All right. Awesome.
it's gonna happen.
All
It's
right. All right.
inevitable.
Okay, just a couple more here. So when do you think there'll be more freelancers, agencies, and dev shops that use no-code tools than ones that don't?
2 years tops.
3 years. All right. All right.
2 years.
Oh, 2 years. All right. That was the closest.
I
the
think
closest,
that that inflection is happening so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like when you realize that there's a better way, it's just all those other agencies start to run circles around you if you're not taking advantage of those tools. It's just like a dev agency that sticks to, okay, we're only going to build our solutions with jQuery or something like that. Like A, they're going to have a hard time hiring people. B, they're going to go much slower than dev agencies that are using more modern, like faster tools. So I think it's just a modernization theme that is also inevitable. And already we see the vast majority of freelancers being aware of no-code tools and using them in some capacity. On the agency side, it's a little different because they do much more sophisticated work, and that's where it's not quite in the most category yet. But I think it's going to cross the 50% threshold like within 2 years.
Awesome. All right, then the final one, I think the question I'm most excited about, when do you think global leaders will start talking about no code?
I don't know. Best guess is 3 years because, we already have Satya Nadella from Microsoft playing up citizen developers. We had past presidents like Barack Obama really talk about the power of code, and maybe they won't be talking about it to that degree, but especially with the economic environment now, I think we're going to have a lot of conversations, national and global, around retooling and switching more things to digital than classically were based on physical commerce and things like that. And it's just a natural, I think it's, whether they call it no code or not by name, the fact that we have to, it's almost like an industrial revolution, right? You have to get a population of people to really like modernize and be ready for this new information age. And I think creating software is going to be one of those key skills that a lot of people will have to have to solve all sorts of problems, not just like software problems. Even if they're, like automating a factory, there might be some things that they might start using no-code tools for right now, whether it's like scheduling workers or kind of doing inventory management, et cetera. It doesn't have to be running the factory. But I think that kind of modernization and that, many people call it the digital transformation and have for many years. I think that theme of no code is going to start coming up more and more.
Awesome. All right. And then one last question for you. I know maybe we've gone a little bit over on time. Sorry about that. So the last question is, just kind of ending on maybe what is the best story of something you've seen on no code that motivates you, or, what is just something interesting that you'd like to talk about in the no code space? Just kind of like a no code story that makes you excited, that, keeps you going.
Yeah. I have two. So one that constantly keeps me excited is, I don't know if you know of a nonprofit called New Story Charity. It's a they started 5 years ago, and they started or around 5 years ago, and they were primarily designers, and they went to Haiti after um, just a huge disaster, and saw that so many people were newly homeless, right? And they saw a huge need, and they wanted to provide a solution. It was a crowdfunding site where they wanted to fund families and fund very affordable homes, but they weren't developers, right? So they were able to use Webflow just like 5 years ago now to validate that idea. It looked like an app. It looked like Kickstarter. It looked like GoFundMe, which were in their own right kind of new still, but they were able to, fund one family, then 10 families, then 100 families, then start to augment that with more kind of behind the scenes operations. And now they've raised like tens of millions of dollars. They're now 3D printing homes in a ton of countries. They're now switching to, in a time right now, they're switching to funding rent for underprivileged families. And they just had such massive impact that in my mind, it kind of goes to, what if something like Webflow didn't exist? Like, would this been a fleeting idea that was like, oh, maybe I'll explore this at some point when I learn how to code, and it would never like manifested in the world. And the thing I think about second, and more recently, is when COVID broke out and we all had to shelter in place, and so many businesses had to react very quickly, and so many people wanted to, like start new efforts, whether it was to source masks or help out community members, or like help neighbors pay rent or whatever. There was just a blossoming of new services and products and ways to like community sites that were trying to arbitrate sort of needs, and people who were able to donate and provide those things like there's a site called Masks for Docs that is kind of like that, like people saying, I have masks to donate, and hospitals and service providers and nursing homes saying, we really need this, like in these categories. And they were able to get a lot more masks into the hands of doctors much sooner. And all these things like blossomed in a multiple day period, right? Like people are inspired, they get it up like a couple days later. That to me is like the entire magic and promise of no code. Those if you take the New Story charity idea and what's happening more recently, how many of these things just simply would not exist? People would be like in spreadsheets or doing calls, or just most likely not getting these things out there. And to me, that's the thing that's most inspiring. It's a collection of stories, but to me, that just validates this mission of getting the power of software, getting the power of programming into vastly more hands, and getting that that barrier to entry much lower. It just means much faster solutions, like people actually taking it's just like electricity, right? Like when we invented it, it wasn't good enough until we brought it into a lot more hands, and a lot more people could benefit from it. And I think no code really accelerates that that transition into getting a lot more people to participate in the digital economy, and even if it's not the economy, from just like their digital lives, especially in a time like this. So to me, that's the magic of no code. That's why I think no code is needed way more so than in times in the past, and why I'm so inspired to keep working on it and making it better.
Well, thank you for joining us. Hopefully this also inspires more people to get into the no-code space. I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me, to be a part of this project. It means a lot to me, and I hope it means a lot to everybody else here that's listening or reading this and all that kind of good stuff. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, and hope everyone stays safe and healthy out there.
Yeah. All right. See you, Vlad.
See you, David. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.